There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to places where human beings are not meant to tread. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a snowy morning or the calm of an empty church. It is a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, like the woods are waiting for you to make a mistake. My name is Elias Vance. For 15 years, I've been a tracker and a search and rescue consultant in the Pacific Northwest, operating mostly out of a dead-end logging town in Oregon called Oakhaven. I know the wilderness. I know how to find lost hikers, strayed children, and runaway teens. But more importantly, I know when to stop looking. Beyond the established trails of Oakhaven lies the Blackridge Forest. The locals don't go there. The Native American tribes that used to inhabit this valley moved their settlements miles away centuries ago, calling the area the ground that bleeds. But tourists are stupid. They read about unexplored, pristine wilderness on some dark web forum or an extreme hiking blog, and they think they are conquering nature. They don't realize that in Blackridge, nature conquers you. It digests you. The nightmare began on a Tuesday in late October. The air was already biting cold, smelling of pine needles and impending frost. 3 thrill-seekers walked into my cabin, throwing a stack of $100 bills on my worn wooden table. There was Carter, an arrogant adrenaline junkie with more money than sense. His girlfriend, Mia, whose eyes held a desperate need for social media validation. And a quiet, nervous guy named David, a photographer who hauled around 20 pounds of vintage camera gear. They wanted to reach a specific set of coordinates deep within Blackridge, a place called the Hollows, an urban legend among extreme hikers where the trees supposedly grew in a perfect, unnatural circle. "We need a guide," Carter had said, his voice dripping with entitled confidence. "Everyone in town said you're the guy who knows the woods better than anyone. Name your price, Vance." I should have said no. Every instinct in my gut, every hair on the back of my neck screamed at me to kick them out. But my bank account was empty. The bank was threatening foreclosure on my cabin, and the stack of bills on the table was thick enough to buy me another year of peace. So I took the money. It was the worst mistake of my miserable life. We set out the next morning at dawn. The drive to the trailhead was dead quiet. The sky above us was a bruised, sickly gray, heavy with unfallen snow. As we stepped past the rusted iron chain that marked the end of the state park and the beginning of Blackridge, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Within the first 2 miles, the ambient noise of the forest died. The chirping of birds ceased. The rustling of small game in the underbrush vanished. It was as if we had crossed an invisible threshold into a soundproof room. "Creepy," Mia whispered, adjusting the straps of her oversized backpack. She held up her phone, frowning. "Zero signal. We haven't even gone that far." "That's the point, babe," Carter laughed, though it sounded forced. "Off the grid." I didn't laugh. My eyes were scanning the tree line. The pines here were ancient, their trunks thick and twisted, their bark covered in a sickly black moss that looked like dried blood. Their branches didn't reach up toward the sun. They seemed to hook downward, like skeletal fingers reaching for the forest floor. By midday, we found the first sign that we were not alone. David, the photographer, had wandered a few yards off the path to take a picture of a massive, hollowed-out oak tree. I heard him gasp, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a dry heave. "Elias," he called out, his voice trembling, "you need to see this." I unholstered my hunting knife and approached him, with Carter and Mia following close behind. Lying at the base of the oak was a black bear. But it wasn't just dead. It was dismantled. It takes immense, unthinkable strength to kill a fully grown black bear, let alone tear it apart. The creature's ribcage was cracked open, pointing outward like the petals of a grotesque bloody flower. Its organs were gone, but not eaten in a frenzy. They were completely missing, as if surgically removed. The most terrifying part, however, was the skin. The bear had been peeled, The fur and hide draped meticulously over the lower branches of the oak tree like a sick, twisted tapestry. Mia vomited immediately, clutching her stomach as she retched onto the dead leaves. Carter's face drained of color. What does that?" Carter stammered, stepping back. "A mountain lion? Another bear?" "Bears don't string up their kills for display," I said quietly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I examined the claw marks on the tree trunk. They were deep, gouging an inch into the solid wood, and they started 8 feet off the ground. Whatever did this was impossibly tall, and its claws were like steel blades. "We need to turn back, right now." "No," Carter snapped, suddenly defensive, trying to mask his terror with anger. "I paid you $5,000, Vance. We are halfway to the coordinates. We are not turning back because of a dead animal." "That's not just a dead animal, Carter," I growled, grabbing him by the collar of his expensive Gore-Tex jacket. "That is a warning. This is a predator's territory, and it's playing with its food. If we stay, we become the food." Before we could argue further, a sound echoed through the woods. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to originate from the ground beneath our boots, rising into a guttural, rattling growl. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It sounded like a man trying to scream through a throat full of crushed glass, mixed with the roar of an apex predator. The sound came from all directions at once, bouncing off the ancient trees, disorienting us. "We set up camp here," I ordered, my voice leaving no room for debate. "We don't move in the dark. We build a fire, a big one, and at first light, we run back to the truck. Understood?" Fear had finally paralyzed Carter's ego. He nodded slowly. Nightfall in Blackridge doesn't happen gradually. The sun doesn't set. The darkness just swallows the light. By 7 p.m., the forest was pitch black, illuminated only by the frantic, leaping orange flames of our campfire. The temperature plummeted to freezing. We sat in a tight circle. No one spoke. David was obsessively clicking the shutter of his camera into the dark, using the flash to illuminate the trees for a fraction of a second, terrified of what might be lurking just beyond the firelight. Mia was quietly crying, her head buried in her knees. "Stop doing that, David," I hissed. The sudden bursts of light were ruining my night vision. "I need to see," David whispered frantically. I feel like it's looking right at me." "There's nothing out there," Carter lied to himself, taking a long pull from a silver flask. "Just the wind." Then the smell hit us. It was a thick, gagging odor of rotten meat, wet dog, and old copper. It was so intense I could taste it on the back of my tongue. Snap! A heavy branch broke in the darkness, about 50 yards to our left. I stood up slowly, raising my high-powered hunting rifle, aiming it into the void. "Who's there?" I yelled, though I knew no human would answer. Nothing. Then Mia whimpered. "Carter, I need to pee." "Hold it," I told her, not taking my eyes off the tree line. "I can't," she cried, panic lacing her voice. "I've been holding it for hours. I'll just go right behind the tent. 2 seconds. "I'll go with you," Carter said, standing up on shaky legs, grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight. "Do not go further than 5 feet from the fire," I commanded. They walked behind the large canvas tent. David and I stayed by the fire. The silence returned, thicker than before. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, the flashlight being behind the tent went wild, spinning frantically into the canopy. "Carter?" Mia's voice wasn't just scared, it was confused. "Carter, what are you doing? Let go of me." "Mia, get back here," I yelled, rushing toward the tent. Before I could reach the corner of the canvas, Mia let out a scream that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. It wasn't a Hollywood scream. It was the primal, lung-tearing shriek of a human being realizing they are being torn out of the food chain. The scream was abruptly cut off by a wet, sickening crunch, like a thick tree branch snapping inside a sack of wet mud. I rounded the tent, raising my rifle. The flashlight was rolling on the ground, casting a chaotic spinning beam through the trees. Carter was on his knees, covered in blood, staring blankly ahead. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his mind completely shattered by whatever he had just witnessed. Of Mia, There was nothing left but her oversized backpack lying in a pool of fresh, steaming blood that melted the frost on the ground. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it up into the trees, following a trail of dark crimson splatters. There, perched on a thick branch 30 feet in the air, was the beast. My brain refused to process the image. It was roughly the shape of a wolf, but it was the size of a draft horse. Its fur was matted, pitch black, and glistening with a strange, oily residue. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural, spider-like angles to grip the tree bark. But its face, dear God, its face! The muzzle was elongated, dripping with fresh gore, but the eyes were not those of an animal. They were pale, glowing white orbs, filled with a sick, ancient malice. It wasn't just acting on instinct, it was enjoying this. From its jaws, Mia's severed left arm hung limply, her silver charm bracelet reflecting the beam of my flashlight. The beast didn't roar. It looked directly down at me, tilted its massive head with human-like curiosity, and then, slowly, the corners of its bloody mouth curled upward. The wolf smiled, and then, with lightning speed, it vanished into the upper canopy of the dark forest, taking the rest of Mia with it. I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones, realizing that we weren't just lost in the woods. We were trapped in hell, and the devil had teeth. The silence that followed the creature's retreat was not a relief. It was a deeper, more profound terror. It was the silence of a tomb just before the stone slab is sealed. Carter remained on his knees in the frozen mud, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the empty branch where the impossible beast had smiled. His breathing was a ragged, wet, wheezing sound. He was catatonic, his mind completely shut down by the sheer, unfiltered horror of seeing his girlfriend dismantled and abetted in the span of 3 seconds. David was not silent. He was hysterical. He had dropped his camera, the expensive lens cracking against a rock, and was now hyperventilating, clutching his hair with both hands, his body racked with violent shivers. "It took her. It just took her up like she was nothing," David mumbled, his voice rising in pitch with every word. "Mia, oh God, Mia, we're going to die here. Elias, we're going to die here." "Shut up, David," I snapped, my voice harsh, a desperate attempt to inject some authority back into the nightmare. My own hands were shaking as I racked a fresh round into the chamber of my rifle. The metallic clack echoed unnervingly in the oppressive quiet. I walked over to Mia's backpack, lying in that spreading pool of steam and crimson. It was the only tangible proof she had ever existed here. The smell of copper and gut was overwhelming. I looked up at the black canopy. Nothing moved. This was not a normal wolf. I had seen wolves kill. They are brutal, efficient, and instinctual. This thing, it was sadistic, it was immense, and it was smart. The way it looked at me, the calculated cruelty of its smile, that didn't belong to a beast. That belonged to a demon. "Get up," I told Carter, grabbing his shoulder. He didn't react. I slapped him hard across the face. "Get up, Carter, unless you want to join her." The shock registered slowly. He blinked, looking at me with dead eyes. "Mia?" he whispered. "Mia is gone," I said bluntly. I didn't have time for grief. I had time for survival. And if we don't move right now, we are next. David, get your gear. We can't stay at this camp. The established logic of wilderness survival said, stay put by the fire. In Blackridge, that was a dinner invitation. Our fire, once a source of comfort, was now a beacon. We packed in frantic silence. Carter was useless, moving like a ghost. I forced a pack onto his back. David grabbed his camera bag, leaving the expensive tripod behind. We left the large tent standing, a sacrifice to the darkness. Our only chance was to reach the Fang, a massive granite outcrop about 4 hours away. It was steep, exposed, and easily defensible from a ground-based predator. It was the only place I knew within reach that offered any sort of tactical advantage against whatever that thing was. I took the lead, flashlight cutting a weak beam into the crushing blackness. I didn't follow the trail. The trail was where it would expect us. I led us cross-country, through the dense underbrush and over frozen fallen logs. Blackridge was different at night. The trees didn't just feel ancient, they felt alive, watching us, leaning in to listen to our frantic heartbeats. The black moss on the bark seemed to shimmer slightly in our flashlight beams, like drying blood. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of dry leaves in the windless air made us jump, weapons drawn. An hour into our desperate march, the psychological torture began. It didn't attack us directly. It knew we were armed, aware. It preferred to break us first. Thump. A heavy sound, maybe 20 yards to our right, the weight of it vibrating through the ground. We stopped, turning our lights. Nothing but twisted trees. Thump. 50 yards to our left. It was herding us, testing our reactions, seeing who would crack first. Then, the auditory hallucinations began. Or perhaps they weren't hallucinations. I heard it first. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Elias, help me!" My blood turned to ice. It was Mia's voice, high, terrified, but distorted as if played through a scratched record. "Did you hear that?" David whispered, his face ghastly pale in the flashlight beam. That was Mia." "No, it wasn't," I said. My teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. "Mia is dead." "Elias, it hurts so much," the voice cried out again, louder this time, coming from the upper canopy of the trees behind us. Carter broke. He dropped his pack and started screaming, running blindly toward the voice. "Mia, I'm coming!" "Carter, no!" I tackled him, slamming him into the frozen earth. He fought me with the manic strength of a terrified child. "It's not her, Carter! It's a trick! It's mimicking her!" The idea was too horrifying to process, yet it was the only explanation. This beast was not just a hunter. It was a psychological tormentor. It was using the voice of their dead friend to lure them into the dark. Carter finally stopped struggling, weeping into the dirt. We dragged him back up and kept moving. The Mia voice continued for another mile, begging, screaming for help, then dissolving into a wet, gargling rattle before falling silent. By the time we saw the silhouette of the Fang looming ahead, we were exhausted, mentally shattered, and half frozen. The massive granite dome rose 200 feet above the tree line, a jagged monolith offering a precarious sanctuary. We reached the base of the rock and started climbing. It was a treacherous ascent. The granite was covered in patches of thin ice. David, burdened by his gear and shivering uncontrollably, struggled to keep his footing. I had to pull him up several short, steep sections. We finally reached a wide ledge about 80 feet up the face of the rock. It was a natural shelf, perhaps 15 feet deep, backing into a shallow cave. "We stop here," I panted, throwing my back down. "It can't get to us here without us seeing it." "We don't need a big fire, just enough to keep us from freezing." We built a small fire from dry juniper branches. The heat was a small mercy. David huddled near the back of the cave, clutching his cracked camera. He began obsessively looking through the photos he had taken back at the first camp before Mia was taken. "What are you doing?" I asked, checking the ammunition count in my pockets. "I need to know what I saw," David whispered, zooming in on an image on the tiny LCD screen of his camera. His breathing hitched. "Oh God, oh sweet Jesus. What is it?" I walked over, looking over his shoulder. It was one of the photos David had taken with the flash into the dark forest just before they went behind the tent. In the fraction of a second the flash had illuminated the woods, it had caught something. At the edge of the frame, blending almost perfectly with the black moss of an ancient pine tree, was a cluster of pale, circular objects. They weren't eyes. I took the camera from his shaking hands and zoomed in further. My stomach did a slow, nauseous flip. They were skulls, human skulls, dozens of them, tied together with long strands of what looked like human hair, draped over a high branch like a grotesque, macabre garland. Some were yellow with age. Others were still covered in decomposing flesh, their jawbones open in eternal screams. This wasn't just a hunting ground. This was a trophy room. Blackridge was not just a place where people got lost. It was where they were harvested. We were never supposed to leave, David mumbled, rocking back and forth. It brought us here. I gave him back the camera and walked to the edge of the ledge, looking down at the dark tree line below. The realization was sinking in. My experience as a tracker was meaningless here. This thing didn't follow the rules of nature. It was nature, warped, sadistic, and hateful. The fire cracked, casting our shadows against the back wall of the shallow cave. "It can't climb granite, right, Elias?" Carter asked from the corner. He had been silent since the voice incident. He was staring at the small fire with a look of terrifying tranquility. "Most animals can't climb a sheer face," I lied. The beast that had smiled at me from 30 feet up a pine tree didn't care about sheer faces. The hours stretched on. The air grew colder, bitingly cold. Our breath misted in the flashlight beams. The fire was dying. Around 3 a.m., the smell returned. It didn't drift in with the wind. It just materialized, thick and oppressive. Rotten meat and copper. "It's here," I whispered, lifting the rifle, scanning the tree line below. "David, get your flashlight. Aim it down." David was too terrified to move. I grabbed the heavy flashlight myself, aiming the powerful beam down the granite face. The beam cut through the freezing mist, and there it was. It wasn't below us in the trees. It was on the face of the fang, 50 feet below the ledge. The beast was not climbing like a wolf or a bear. It was adhering to the granite, moving with the spider-like agility I had seen before. Its unnaturally long limbs were gripping imperceptible grooves in the stone, its skeletal body moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. As the light hit it, it stopped. It was positioned vertically, head facing up. Its matted black fur was slick with ice. It tilted its head to the side, looking directly at me with those vacant, glowing white orbs. "Oh my God," Carter breathed, standing up behind me. He didn't sound scared anymore. He sounded captivated. "It's beautiful." "Get back, Carter," I yelled, bringing the rifle scope to my eye. I aimed for the center of that massive chest. Before I could pull the trigger, the creature opened its mouth. It didn't scream or growl. It let out a sound of wet, tearing cartilage, a guttural, wet retch. And then, from its monstrous maw, something wet and heavy hit the ledge in front of us with a sickening splat. The flashlight beam caught it. It was a mass of fresh, gray muscle, still steaming in the freezing air, surrounded by jagged shards of bone. I recognized the texture immediately. It was the stomach. And next to it, partially dissolved by acid, but still recognizable, was a high-tech hiking boot with pink laces. "Mia." "No," David whimpered. He didn't just scream. He wenched on his own pile. The beast on the wall wasn't just hurting us. It had been digesting our friend, and it had just returned her remains to us as a statement. That moment of shock was what it was waiting for. With a speed that defied physics, the wolf exploded up the rest of the rock face. I fired a round blindly, the muzzle flash blinding me for a second, but I missed. It launched itself from the wall, clearing the last 10 feet and landing on the ledge with a thud that shook the rock beneath our boots. It was larger up close, impossibly large. The stench was a physical force. Its fur was matted with dried blood, and from its jowls, fresh black ichor dripped, melting the ice on the ledge. Its white eyes surveyed us. David was frozen against the cave wall. I was aiming the rifle, but my arms were shaking with adrenaline and cold. Carter was standing nearby, watching the creature with an idiotic smile of admiration. The beast made its choice. It didn't go for me, the threat with the gun. It didn't go for the screaming David. It turned its massive head toward Carter. "It's okay," Carter whispered, raising a hand to touch the matted fur. The beast lunged. It was a movement too fast for the human eye to track. One moment Carter was standing, the next he was in the creature's jaws. The sound that followed was the sound of a human being ceasing to be. The beast clamped its jaws down on Carter's midsection. I heard the distinct, loud crunch of his spine snapping, the sickening pop of his ribs collapsing inward. Carter didn't even have time to scream. His breath was forced out of his body in a final, wet gasp, spraying a mist of blood across the cave wall. The wolf didn't kill him to eat him. It shook him violently, left and right, like a dog with a rag doll. Carter's limbs flailed uselessly, breaking against the wolf's iron-hard body. I fired again, hitting the beast in the shoulder. A spray of black, tar-like fluid erupted from the wound. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't growl in pain. It ignored me. With a sudden jerk, the wolf tossed Carter's broken, lifeless body across the ledge. He hit the granite wall with another wet crunch and crumpled to the ground, a disjointed mess of broken bone and gore. The creature didn't stop to admire its kill. It turned its glowing white eyes back to me. It opened its mouth again, and this time the sound that came out was a high-pitched, chaotic chirping noise, like 1,000 insects grinding their teeth together. It was a laugh. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the wolf bounded off the ledge, diving into the void of the 90-foot drop into the trees. I ran to the edge, aiming the rifle. I saw nothing, heard nothing, no sound of it hitting the ground, no rustling of branches. It had just disappeared. I was alone on the ledge, 80 feet up a rock face in the middle of a haunted forest, with the mutilated remains of 2 friends and a third who had just been snapped like a dry twig. The fire was almost out. I sat back against the cave wall, my body numb, my mind refusing to function. The silence had returned, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the memory of the wet crunch, the memory of that chirping laugh. And most terrifying of all, I realized why it had taken Carter so quickly and then left. It didn't just want us dead. It was pruning us. It had taken the weakest among us first. It had taken Mia, the attention seeker, and Carter, the arrogant, leaving David, the coward, and me, the experienced hunter. It was raising the stakes. It was making the game more interesting for itself. I looked over at David, who was curled in a fetal ball, praying silently. He was useless. I was the only one left who knew how to fight nature, and that was exactly why I was still alive. I looked down at Carter's broken form. His expensive watch was still ticking on his lifeless wrist, a mockery of the time he no longer had. I knew that the smile I had seen in the tree was not a one-time occurrence. That thing was watching us right now, somewhere in the black ocean of the forest below, smiling that ancient, sadistic smile, waiting for dawn so the final phase of its game could begin. Dawn did not break in Blackridge Forest. It merely bruised the sky. The darkness slowly bled out, replaced by a sickly, jaundiced gray light that offered no warmth and barely any visibility. The cold was an absolute physical entity, driving needles of ice into my joints and turning every breath into a cloud of stinging vapor. I sat on the narrow granite ledge of the Fang, my rifle resting across my knees, my fingers numb against the trigger guard. I hadn't slept a single second. My eyes felt like they were filled with crushed glass. A few feet away lay the twisted, frozen architecture of what used to be Carter. The extreme drop in temperature overnight had frozen his blood mid-flow, turning the dark crimson splatters across the cave wall into a horrific, glittering mosaic of ice. His body was locked in severe rigor mortis, his limbs jutting out at the same impossible, broken angles the beast had left them in. His face was a mask of frozen agony, his jaw hanging slack, his eyes clouded over with frost. In the furthest corner of our shallow cave, David was curled into a tight, trembling ball. He had spent the last 4 hours muttering a continuous, nonsensical stream of prayers, apologies, and childhood nursery rhymes. His mind had completely fractured. The photographer who wanted to capture the beauty of the wild had looked directly into the abyss, and the abyss had chewed up his sanity. "David," I croaked, my voice sounding like tearing sandpaper. "Get up! We have to move." He didn't respond. He just rocked back and forth, his frozen fingers clutching the shattered remains of his camera. I stood up, my joints popping in the freezing air. I walked over to Carter's corpse. Survival is a cruel, pragmatic master. I didn't feel sorrow for him anymore. I only felt a desperate need to stay alive. Carter was wearing a top-of-the-line, insulated, waterproof survival jacket. I wasn't. With gritted teeth, I grabbed the collar of the jacket and began pulling. It was a macabre, sickening struggle. Carter's frozen, broken arms resisted, the bones grinding together with a wet, chalky sound under the skin. I had to plant my boot on his shoulder to gain leverage, pulling the heavy fabric free with a violent jerk. I stripped off my own freezing flannel and put Carter's jacket on. The inside was sticky with his blood, that it smelled of voided bowels and terror, but it was warm. "David," I barked, walking over and kicking the sole of his boot. "I said get up. If we stay up here, we freeze to death, or it comes back to finish its meal." David looked up at me. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of everything that made him human. "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his lips blue and cracked. "Up here, down there, we are already in its stomach, Elias. We are just waiting to be digested." "I am not dying on this rock," I snarled, hauling him to his feet by the straps of his backpack. "You are going to climb down, and you are going to put one foot in front of the other until we find the logging road. Do you understand me?" I didn't wait for an answer. I forced him toward the edge of the ledge. Looking down, the forest floor was obscured by a thick, unnatural fog. It wasn't the white, wispy mist of a morning mountain. It was dense, oily, and the color of old bruises, a swirling, heavy miasma that clung to the trunks of the ancient pines like a disease. The descent was pure torture. The granite was slick with a layer of black ice. Every handhold was a gamble with a 90-foot drop into the fog below. I went first, guiding David's boots into the crevices. He moved like a mechanical toy running out of battery, weeping silently the entire way down. Twice his foot slipped, and he hung by one bloody hand dangling over the void. I had to grab his belt, hauling him back against the rock face, my own muscles screaming in agony. When our boots finally hit the spongy, decaying earth of the forest floor, I felt no relief. The fog instantly swallowed us. Visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. The oppressive silence was back, but the air felt heavy, saturated with a smell so foul I had to pull my collar over my nose. It was the stench of an open mass grave, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of rusted iron. "Stay close. Do not let go of my backpack," I ordered David, unholstering my high-powered flashlight. The beam didn't pierce the fog. It just illuminated the swirling particles, creating a blinding white wall of light. I turned it off. We were better off relying on the dim, ambient grayness. I checked my compass. The needle was spinning lazily in complete erratic circles. The magnetic field in Blackridge was completely warped. We were flying blind in a labyrinth designed by a monster. We walked for what felt like hours, moving blindly through the dense underbrush. Every twig twisted root looked like a skeletal claw. Every looming shadow in the fog looked like a massive, waiting wolf. The paranoia was eating a hole in my brain. Then the trees began to change. We stumbled into a slight clearing where the fog thinned out just enough to reveal the surrounding woodland. The ancient pines here were dead, but they hadn't fallen. They stood like towering, petrified corpses, and they were decorated. David let out a strangled gasp, falling to his knees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach heaving violently, bile burning the back of my throat. We had found the hollows, the coordinates Carter had paid me to reach. But it wasn't a natural wonder. It was a gallery of atrocities. It was the beast's larder, its workshop, its temple. The clearing was roughly 50 yards across. Every single tree in this circle was stripped of its bark. The bare, white wood was painted with intricate, spiraling symbols, drawn in thick, dried, blackish-red blood. But it was what hung between the trees that shattered the last remnants of my courage. Stretched across the branches, tied with thick, braided ropes of human hair and dried intestines, were skins. Human skins. Dozens of them. They had been meticulously flayed, tanned by the freezing winds, and pinned up like horrific kites. Some were small, perhaps belonging to teenagers or women. Others were massive. They fluttered slightly in a dead wind that I couldn't feel on my face. The ground wasn't covered in leaves. It was carpeted in bones. Rib cages cracked open and arranged in geometric patterns. Skulls stacked atop each other to form crude waist-high pillars. "Oh God, oh God," David wailed, burying his face in the bone-littered dirt, his mind completely broken by the sheer industrial scale of the slaughter. This creature hadn't just killed a few lost hikers. It had been harvesting humanity in this forest for decades, maybe centuries. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It was an artist of agony. I moved forward slowly, my boots crushing brittle clavicles and femurs with sickening snaps. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, petrified oak tree. At its base was a mound of fresh gore. I approached it, the smell of rot so thick I could taste it. It was a pile of organs, limbs, and clothing. I recognized a torn scrap of Mia's pink hiking shirt. I recognized a boot belonging to a hunter who had gone missing 5 years ago. And sitting on top of the pile, carefully arranged to face the entrance of the clearing, was Mia's severed head. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in the exact moment of her agonizing death. Her jaw was unhinged, stuffed with a handful of the black, bloody moss that grew on the trees. "Elias," David whimpered from behind me. "Elias, look at the tree!" I tore my eyes away from Mia's head and looked up at the massive, petrified oak. The trunk wasn't carved. It was grafted. Faces, human faces, were stretched and fused into the dead wood. Their mouths were stretched open in silent, eternal screams. Their eye sockets were empty, black voids. Dozens of faces spiraling up the trunk, becoming part of the forest itself. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the clearing, louder than a gunshot. I spun around, leveling my rifle. The fog at the edge of the clearing began to swirl aggressively. It didn't leap from the trees this time. It walked out of the fog. But it wasn't walking on 4 legs. The beast stepped into the clearing, standing on its hind legs, towering nearly 10 feet tall. Its anatomy was a grotesque mockery of human posture. Its long, heavily muscled arms hung past its knees, ending in long, foot-long, razor-sharp claws that dripped with a foul black ichor. Its chest was barrel-thick, covered in that oily, matted black fur, but I could see the terrifying, shifting muscles underneath. It moved with a slow, deliberate swagger, completely unbothered by my rifle. David didn't run. He just sat there among the bones, screaming, a high-pitched, unending shriek of absolute, unfiltered terror. The wolf thing looked at David, its elongated muzzle pulled back, revealing rows of translucent, jagged teeth that looked more like shattered glass than bone. "Shoot it!" David screamed, his voice cracking. "Elias, shoot it!" I pulled the trigger. The thunder of the high-powered rifle deafened me in the clearing. The heavy-caliber bullet struck the creature dead center in its massive chest. The impact caused a spray of black fluid, and the beast stumbled back half a step. But it didn't fall. It didn't even roar. It simply looked down at the hole in its chest, and then looked back up at me. And then it spoke. It didn't use Mia's voice this time. It used a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates, a deep, vibrating, demonic rumble that resonated in the marrow of my bones. "Your toys sting." The words were clumsy, forced through a vocal tract not meant for human language, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Before I could rack another round, the creature lunged, but not at me. It crossed the 20 yards to David in a single impossible bound. David's scream was cut agonizingly short. The beast didn't bite him. It landed on top of David, its massive weight pinning the photographer to the bed of bones. The creature reached down with its horrific clawed hands. It grabbed David by the shoulders. "No, please!" "No," David gurgled, blood already bubbling from his mouth from the crushing weight. The beast looked directly into my eyes, maintaining intense, dead-eye contact. It smiled that same sadistic, human-like smile. And then, very slowly, very deliberately, it pulled its arms apart. The sound was indescribable. It was the sound of thick canvas ripping, combined with the wet snapping of tree branches and the popping of heavy ropes under extreme tension. David's body was being torn perfectly in half down the middle. A fountain of crimson erupted upward, showering the white, bone-littered ground in a hot, steaming rain. Internal organs spilled out in a massive, wet rush, sliding over the skulls and ribs of the previous victims. David's vocal cords snapped, turning his scream into a hollow, wet hiss before his eyes rolled back into his violently bifurcated skull. The creature held the two halves of my client up in the air, the blood raining down over its matted fur like a macabre baptism. It stood there, a towering demon of myth, bathing in the slaughter. It tossed the two halves of David carelessly into the trees, where they hit the branches with sickening wet thuds. Then it dropped back down onto all fours. The transformation from a towering bipedal horror back to a massive predatory beast was seamless and terrifying. It began to circle me, slowly, casually. I was out of companions. I was out of options. The magazine of my rifle felt useless. I was standing in the center of an ancient slaughterhouse, alone with a creature that wore human skins and spoke English with a mouth full of shattered glass. The fog began to close in again, swallowing the petrified trees, swallowing the hanging skins, until it was just me, the bed of crushed bones, and the massive circling shadow of the wolf. "Now," the grinding, monstrous voice echoed from the swirling mist all around me, "we play." The words hung in the freezing air, heavier than the suffocating fog that surrounded me. They didn't just register in my ears, they vibrated against my sternum, a deep tectonic rumble that felt older than the earth beneath my boots. The creature had spoken. It understood the concept of a game, which meant it understood the concept of rules. But in Blackridge Forest, it was the architect, the referee, and the executioner. I stood paralyzed in the center of the bone-strewn clearing, the shattered remains of David slowly cooling into the carpet of skulls and femurs behind me. The hot, metallic scent of his freshly spilled blood was a physical weight in my lungs, competing with the overwhelming stench of ancient rot. My high-powered rifle, which had felt like a heavy, comforting extension of my own body just hours ago, now felt like a useless child's toy. A hollow-point bullet to the chest had done nothing but annoy it. The fog closed in completely, forming a dense, bruised gray wall barely 10 feet away in every direction. The petrified trees with their screaming grafted faces vanished into the mist, leaving me entirely isolated in a pocket of pure, unfiltered nightmare. Then the circling began. I couldn't see the beast, but I could hear it. Click, clack, crunch. The unmistakable sound of razor-sharp, heavy claws stepping delicately over the sea of human bones. It wasn't rushing me. It was pacing the perimeter of the clearing, a massive, unseen shadow moving with the liquid grace of a great white shark circling a shipwreck survivor. My survival instincts, honed by 15 years in the brutal Pacific Northwest wilderness, were screaming at me to run, but logic, cold and sharp, held me in place. If I ran blindly into the fog, I would trip over the bones, or worse, run directly into its waiting jaws. I had to force my panic down into a tight, hard knot in my stomach. I had to stop acting like prey. Click, clack, crunch. It was moving clockwise, fast, too fast for something of its immense size. "Come on, you ugly bastard," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. I tracked the sound, leveling the barrel of my rifle, straining my eyes against the impenetrable mist. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence fell over the clearing, so absolute that the rushing of blood in my own ears sounded like a roaring river. "Elias!" The voice came from directly behind me. It was right at my ear. It was David's voice, not the recorded, distorted mimicry it had used with Mia, but David's exact, terrified cadence, complete with the wet, bubbling sound of blood in his throat. "Elias, why did you let it tear me? It hurts so much, Elias. Put me back together." I spun around, a scream tearing itself from my throat, my finger slamming down on the trigger. Bang! The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the fob, painting the swirling mist in harsh, violent orange. There was nothing there, just empty air and the drifting smoke from the barrel. Before the echo of the gunshot could even fade, an immense, crushing weight slammed into my right side. It was like being hit by a freight train made of ice and iron. I was launched through the air, the rifle flying from my grip and disappearing into the fog. I hit the ground hard, skidding across the jagged surface of cracked ribs and shattered pelvises. Searing pain exploded in my ribs, stealing the breath from my lungs. I tasted copper as I bit completely through my lower lip. I scrambled frantically, trying to find my footing on the unstable, shifting sea of bones. I drew my heavy, serrated hunting knife from its sheath on my thigh. It was an 8-inch blade of carbon steel, but against this demon, it felt like a toothpick. A shape materialized from the gray wall of mist. It was on all fours again, its massive, skeletal shoulders hunched, its terrifying, translucent, glass-like teeth bared in that sickening human smile. It didn't leap. It walked toward me slowly, savoring the terror radiating from my broken body. Black, viscous fluid dripped from the bullet hole in its chest, sizzling slightly as it hit the freezing ground, emitting a faint, acrid smoke. It wasn't bleeding, it was leaking. I pushed myself backwards, crawling like a terrified crab, my left hand scrambling over skulls, my right hand gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles were bone white. "Stay back!" I roared, a pathetic, animalistic sound of desperation. The wolf lunged. The speed was incomprehensible. One microsecond it was 15 feet away, the next its massive jaws were snapping shut inches from my face. The sheer force of its jaws closing created a concussive pop in the air. I rolled violently to the left, the jagged edge of a broken human femur tearing through Carter's borrowed jacket and slicing a deep gash into my thigh. I ignored the burning agony. The beast's momentum carried it past me, its massive claws tearing a trench through the bed of bones. It pivoted with unnatural agility, its glowing wide eyes locking onto me. It swiped its massive, articulated front paw. I raised my left arm instinctively to protect my face. The claws, longer than my forearms and sharp as scalpels, tore through the thick, insulated fabric of the jacket, sliced through my thermal shirt, and dug deep into the flesh of my forearm. The pain was blinding, a white-hot electrical shock that short-circuited my brain. I screamed, but adrenaline, the final desperate gift of a dying body, surged through my veins. As the beast pulled its arm back to strike again, I lunged forward inside its guard. I drove the heavy hunting knife upward with every ounce of strength I possessed, aiming for the soft tissue under its jaw. The blade sank in, burying itself to the hilt in the creature's thick, matted neck, but it didn't feel like cutting flesh. It felt like plunging a knife into tightly packed wet gravel mixed with thick tar. The creature didn't howl in pain. Instead, it let out that horrific, chaotic, insect-like chirping laugh. The beast snapped its head to the side with casual, devastating force. The movement wrenched the knife from my grip, snapping my wrist with a loud, sickening crack. I was thrown backward again, landing hard against the base of one of the petrified trees. I slumped against the cold, dead wood, clutching my useless, rapidly swelling wrist against my chest. Blood poured freely from the deep lacerations on my left arm and my right thigh, soaking into my clothes and freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. The creature stood over me. The handle of my hunting knife protruded from its neck, black ichor bubbling sluggishly around the blade. It raised a massive, clawed hand, reached up, and deliberately, slowly, pulled the knife out of its own flesh. It examined the bloody blade with an unsettling, intelligent curiosity, then tossed it aside into the fog. It looked down at me, its glowing eyes devoid of anything remotely recognizable as a soul. It was going to end me. It had had its fun. It opened its horrific maw, the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses washing over my face, causing me to gag helplessly. It leaned in, the translucent, jagged teeth inches from my throat. But then, it stopped. Its ears, ragged and torn, twitched toward the cabbie above. It snapped its jaws shut and slowly turned its massive head, staring deep into the fog behind it. For the first time, the creature's posture changed. The sadistic arrogance vanished, replaced by an intense, rigid stillness. It wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking at something else in the forest, something that made even this demon pause. Without a sound, without a backward glance, the beast dissolved into the fog, moving with complete, terrifying silence. Within 2 seconds, it was entirely gone, leaving me alone at the base of the screaming tree. I didn't waste time wondering why it had spared me or what had distracted it. The calculus of survival was simple. I was bleeding out, I was freezing, and I was unarmed. I had a window of perhaps 5 minutes before shock set him completely. I forced myself up. The pain in my leg was excruciating, sending violent spasms up my spine with every ounce of weight I put on it. I tore the sleeve off my thermal shirt with my teeth and my good hand, wrapping it brutally tight around my shredded left arm to stem the arterial bleeding. I did the same for the deep gash on my thigh. It was clumsy, dirty first aid, and if the blood loss didn't kill me, the infection from this cursed soil certainly would. But it bought me time. I limped away from the clearing, plunging blindly into the thick fog and the dense, twisted underbrush of Blackridge. I had no compass, no rifle, no sense of direction. I just needed to put distance between myself and the hollows. The forest seemed to fight my escape. The ancient pines crowded closer together, their branches hooking into my clothes like skeletal fingers trying to drag me down. The ground grew uneven, treacherous, covered in slippery black moss and hidden jagged rocks. The psychological torture resumed, but this time it was my own mind breaking under the strain. The blood loss and the extreme cold were inducing severe hallucinations. The shadows and the fog twisted into the shapes of Mia, Carter, and David. They walked alongside me in the mist, their bodies mutilated, their faces pale and dead. "You left us, Elias," Mia whispered from the fog on my left, her severed head floating seamlessly over the dark moss. "You're a terrible guide," Carter mocked from my right, his broken, frozen limbs clicking together as he moved. "Keep walking, dead man," David gurgled, dragging his bifurcated torso across the freezing mud behind me. "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" I muttered to myself, a manic mantra, closing my eyes and forcing myself to keep moving forward. I stumbled, fell, dragged myself through freezing mud, and forced myself back up a dozen times. Every breath was a shard of ice in my lungs. My vision was tunneling, the edges of my sight turning black and fuzzy. I was dying. I knew the signs. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a strange, lethargic warmth, the final deceptive comfort of severe hypothermia. My body was shutting down. Just as I prepared to collapse against the trunk of a massive, rotting cedar and let the darkness take me, the fog parted slightly, revealing a shape that didn't belong in the natural geometry of the woods. It was a structure. I dragged my useless, bleeding leg toward it, praying it wasn't another hallucination. As I got closer, the details emerged from the gloom. It was an old logging cabin, ancient and half-collapsed, sinking into the damp earth. The wood was black with rot, and the roof had partially caved in, but the thick, iron-reinforced door was still intact. It was a relic from the late 1800s, back when logging companies first tried to conquer Blackridge before the forest drove them entirely mad. I practically fell against the heavy door, my bloody hands fumbling blindly for a handle. There was a rusted iron latch. I pushed it with all the pathetic weight I had left. With a horrific, groaning squeal of rusted hinges, the door gave way, and I spilled onto the dusty, dry wooden floorboards of the cabin interior. I kicked the door shut behind me, the sound booming in the enclosed space. I frantically searched the floor in the dim light filtering through the cracked walls. I found a heavy iron drop bar and with agonizing effort slotted it into the brackets across the door, barricading myself inside. I collapsed onto my back, my chest heaving, staring up at the rotting rafters. The air inside smelled of dust, dry rot, and old, undisturbed isolation. It was freezing, but there was no wind, no fog, and for a fleeting second, no monsters. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the cabin, my fleeting sense of relief was violently obliterated. I slowly turned my head. The cabin was not empty. The walls were entirely covered in frantic, overlapping scratches, deep gouges in the thick wood, made by human fingernails and hunting knives. Words were carved into the walls, thousands of times, in a manic, spiraling pattern. "Do not let it in. It wears their faces. The ground demands blood. It is always hungry." And in the center of the room, sitting perfectly upright in a rotting wooden rocking chair, was a skeleton. It was wearing the tattered remains of a 19th century logger's uniform. In its bony, dust-covered hands, it held a rusted double-barreled shotgun. pointing directly at the door I had just barricaded. I wasn't the first person to seek sanctuary here. I was just the latest rat to run into the trap. Outside, beyond the thick wooden walls, the silence of the forest was broken. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the ground, accompanied by the distinct, heavy crunch of a massive claw stepping onto the wooden porch. The beast hadn't spared me. It had just let me run to my own grave. And as the handle of the barricaded door began to slowly, violently rattle, I knew the final chapter of my life was about to begin. The rattling of the heavy iron door handle wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of a predator knocking on a coffin, politely asking the corpse inside to come out and play. I lay on the dusty floorboards of the ruined cabin, my breath coming in shallow, agonizing rasps. My left arm and right thigh were wrapped in blood-soaked, freezing rags, and my broken wrist throbbed with a sickening, synchronized rhythm to the rattling door. The ambient temperature in the cabin was plunging, my own exhaled breath falling as a heavy frost onto my borrowed blood-stained jacket. I forced my eyes away from the violently splintering door and back to the center of the room. The skeletal logger sitting in the rocking chair seemed to be grinning at me through the gloom, his hollow eye sockets bearing witness to a tragedy repeating itself across a century. I dragged my broken body across the floorboards, leaving a thick, dark smear of my own blood on the ancient wood. I reached the rocking chair and pulled myself up. The skeleton was brittle, draped in a rotting wool coat that fell to dust beneath my touch. I reached out with my good hand and gripped the rusted double-barreled shotgun resting across the dead man's lap. I expected resistance, perhaps the rigor mortis of a century-old ghost, but the weapon slid easily into my grasp. The bones of the logger's hands simply crumbled into gray powder. It was a massive 10-gauge, a heavy, brutal piece of 19th century iron and walnut. I cracked the breech open. It groaned, shedding flakes of rust, but the mechanism held. Inside the chambers rested two massive brass shells. They weren't standard ammunition. The brass was meticulously carved with intricate spiraling symbols, the exact inverse of the bloody runes I had seen painted on the trees in The Hollows. The primers were sealed with what looked like dried white wax. The logger hadn't died hiding. He had died waiting. I looked down at the floorboards beneath the rocking chair. Carved deeply into the wood, etched with a frantic, desperate hand, was a final message. Lead does not bite it. The ground demands to drink. Burn the vessel. Fire is the only cleanse. God forgive me. A sudden, deafening crack shattered the silence. The heavy iron drop bar I had used to barricade the door bent inward, groaning under an impossible crushing pressure from the outside. Elias. The voice slithered through the cracks in the splintering wood. It wasn't David. It wasn't Mia. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices, men, women, children, all layered over one another, weeping, screaming, and whispering my name simultaneously. It was the collective agony of every soul harvested in Blackridge, weaponized to break my sanity. Open the door, Elias. We are so called. Let us in. Go to hell, I croaked, my voice a pathetic dry rasp. I snapped the breech of the shotgun shut. The metallic click echoed with profound finality. Hell is already here, little tracker. The demonic, grinding voice of the beast overpowered the chorus. The sound vibrated the very dust off the rafters. And you are keeping me waiting. The door exploded inward. The heavy iron hinges sheared off like cheap plastic. The thick oak planks fragmented into 1,000 lethal splinters, showering the interior of the cabin. Through the ruined doorway, the fog poured in like a living, breathing entity, followed immediately by the horror itself. It couldn't fit. The beast was too massive, its shoulders too broad, its unnatural height too towering for the old human-sized doorframe. But it didn't care. It forced its way inside, the wood of the cabin screaming and tearing as the creature's sheer mass splintered the doorframe. Black, oily fur scraped against jagged wood. Razor-sharp claws gouged deep trenches into the floorboards as it dragged its horrific bulk into the room. The stench hit me like a physical blow, a sickening wave of rotting meat, copper, and sulfur. It stood to its full height, or as much as the low ceiling would allow. Its head was hunched forward, its glowing white, soulless eyes locking onto me. The handle of my hunting knife was still protruding from its thick neck, oozing that black, smoking tar. Its translucent, shattered glass teeth bared in a grin that stretched too far across its elongated muzzle. It took a step forward. The floorboards groaned in agony. I didn't have time to aim gracefully. I tucked the heavy stock of the 10-gauge under my bleeding right arm, bracing it against my ribs, and supported the heavy barrel with my broken left wrist, ignoring the blinding flash of white-hot pain that shot up my arm. "Eat this, you son of a bitch!" I screamed and pulled the front trigger. The recoil was apocalyptic. It felt like being kicked in the chest by a mule. The blast threw me backward, slamming me into the rotting wall of the cabin. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. But it wasn't a spray of lead buckshot. The carved brass shell detonated with a blinding magnesium white flash. A cone of searing, incandescent fire erupted from the barrel, carrying a payload of pulverized silver, rock salt, and something ancient and volatile. The blast hit the beast square in the left shoulder. For the first time since I stepped into Blackridge Forest, the creature didn't laugh. It roared. It was a sound of absolute, universe-shattering pain. The roar was so loud it shattered the remaining unbroken floorboards and burst my left eardrum, leaving a high-pitched, ringing void in my head. The blast had violently amputated the creature's massive left arm at the shoulder. Black, boiling ichor sprayed across the cabin, sizzling and burning through the wood like concentrate acid. The beast stumbled, its impossible balance broken, and it crashed into the rotting support pillar in the center of the room. The ceiling groaned, dust and debris raining down upon us. But it wasn't dead. The beast whipped its massive head toward me, its white eyes now burning with a hatred so intense it felt radioactive. It lunged, its remaining right arm sweeping out in a devastating arc. I rolled desperately to the right, but I was too slow. The back of its massive clawed hand clipped my legs, sending me spinning across the floor. I crashed into a dusty corner, dropping the shotgun. The beast was on me in a second. It pinned me to the floor with its remaining hand, its claws digging deep into my chest, piercing my jacket, my shirt, and grating against my ribs. The crushing weight was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My vision began to swim with black spots. It lowered its horrific face down to mine. The translucent teeth were dripping with thick black saliva that burned wherever it touched my skin. "I will peel you slow." The grinding, tectonic voice vibrated directly into my skull. "I will wear your face while you watch." It opened its jaw, unhinging it like a snake, preparing to tear my throat out. My right hand, sliding frantically across the debris-covered floor, hit cold, heavy iron. The shotgun. I had one shell left. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline born of pure, unadulterated terror, I gripped the barrel of the massive gun. I didn't try to aim it at its body. As the beast lunged its open maw toward my neck, I jammed the twin steel barrels directly upward, plunging them deep into the creature's gaping mouth, past the shattered glass teeth, and into the wet, fleshy back of its throat. The beast's eyes widened in a split second of shock. It bit down instinctively, its teeth crushing the thick steel of the barrels, trapping the gun. I reached down, my thumb finding the rear trigger. "Burn," I whispered. I pulled the trigger. The second modified shell detonated inside the creature's skull. The muffled concussive explosion sent a shockwave through the beast's body. The top of its massive, wolf-like head simply ceased to exist, expanding outward in a violent eruption of black fluid, gray matter, and shattered bone. The creature's body went rigid. The glowing white light in its eyes flickered and died, replaced by empty black voids. The immense pressure on my chest released as the beast slumped backward, a headless mountain of matted fur and muscle collapsing onto the floorboards. The acidic, boiling black ichor was pouring from its ruined neck, pooling on the dry, century-old wood of the cabin. Wherever the black blood touched the wood, it began to smoke violently. Within seconds, tiny, unnatural blue flames began to lick across the floorboards. "Fire is the only cleanse." The logger's words echoed in my mind. The vessel was dead, but the corruption was highly flammable. The cabin was catching fire rapidly, the dry rot acting as the perfect kindling. I didn't wait to watch it burn. I dragged myself out from under the beast's twitching corpse. My body was completely broken. My ribs felt shattered. My wrist was destroyed, and I was bleeding from a dozen deep lacerations. I crawled out through the splintered, ruined doorway and collapsed onto the freezing mud of the forest floor. The fog was finally beginning to lift, burned away by the unnatural heat radiating from the blazing cabin. I dragged myself away from the inferno, using my elbows and my one good knee, leaving a trail of blood in the melting frost. Behind me, the old logging cabin became a towering pyre, roaring into the bruised morning sky, consuming the century-old bones of the logger and the headless corpse of the demon. I crawled for what felt like days. I crawled until my hands were torn to shreds, until my clothes were frozen to my skin, until my mind completely disconnected from the pain. I don't remember reaching the edge of the tree line. I don't remember seeing the rusted iron chain that marked the boundary of the state park. My first lucid memory is waking up in a sterile, painfully bright hospital room in Portland, hooked up to a dozen IV bags and monitors. A state trooper with a grim face was sitting in a plastic chair near the door. They told me a pair of local hunters found me lying unconscious in the middle of the paved highway, miles from the trailhead. I was clinically dead from blood loss and severe hypothermia for 2 minutes in the back of the ambulance before they brought me back. They searched Blackridge for Carter, Mia, and David. They mounted a massive rescue operation involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and dozens of volunteers. They found nothing. No tent, no camera, no bodies. And they never found the hollows. The search parties reported that the forest seemed empty, quiet. The magnetic anomalies that ruined compasses were gone. The official police report stated that we were attacked by a rogue, unusually aggressive grizzly bear, and that my clients had likely been dragged into a ravine or a cave system. They wrote off my frantic, hysterical ravings about a giant speaking wolf and a clearing of human skins as the severe stress-induced hallucinations of a man suffering from profound trauma and hypothermia. I let them believe it. I stopped talking about it. It's been 3 years since that night. I walk with a severe limp. My left hand is permanently curled into a stiff claw, and my body is a canvas of thick, jagged scars. I moved out of the Pacific Northwest. I live in a high-rise apartment in a massive city of concrete and steel, as far away from the woods as a man can physically get. I don't go near parks. I don't look at trees. I survived Blackridge Forest. I killed the vessel. I burned the temple. But every night when I close my eyes, I don't see the sterile walls of my apartment. I see the heavy, bruised gray fog. I smell the overwhelming scent of rotting meat and copper. And sometimes, when the city outside my window goes dead quiet in the middle of the night, I hear it. Not a howl, not the wind. I hear the heavy, deliberate click, clack, crunch of massive claws pacing the hallway outside my locked door, and I hear David's voice, wet and distorted, whispering through the keyhole. "The ground still bleeds, Elias, and it is always hungry."